In this video, you're going to see an introduction to what we call logarithms, and you're going to learn what those are about. We're going to start off today by just doing the graphs of them and then looking at what logarithms look like. So if you can get your heading on your paper the way that you see it, make sure you pause the video if you need to. We're going to do a little bit of review of equations and inverses before we get into logarithms. So the first thing we're going to do, make sure you write a review, is we are going to graph the function f of x equals 2 to the x. So if you need to pause the video, write that down for me. What we're going to do is we are going to make a table first, and then we're going to just make a rough sketch of what the graph looks like, just to get an idea. So what I did was I made a table, and I'm going to put x, and then I'm going to put f of x inside. And I'm going to use the x values of -3 to 3. So in our table, we're going to put -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to give you those values just for the sake of speeding up time. So if I was to plug in -3 here, 2 to the -3rd power, remember the negative exponent makes it 1 over 2 to the 3rd. So that's 1/8. And if we do 2 to the -2nd power, that's 1/4. 2 to the -1 power is just 1 over 2, or 1/2. Now it gets a little easier. 2 to the 0 is 1. Anything to the 0 power is 1. 2 to the 1st is 2. 2 to the 2nd is 4. And 2 to the 3rd is 8. So if I just want to see what it looks like, I'm going to be making a sketch of this. I'm going to go to y equals and type in 2 to the x. And make sure my table looks good, my window. And I'm going to hit graph. And this is what the graph looks like. So I'm going to make a little sketch over on the side. So I'm going to have my x and y axis. And we're just sketching, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm going to use a different color for that. So that's my equation that looked something like this, if I was to graph all of those points. So I'm going to label that. That is my f, I'm going to put y equals 2 to the x. I'm using y because it's an equation, or it's a graph. Now I'm going to graph the inverse of it. So for number 2, you want to write graph the inverse of f of x equals 2 to the x power. So while you're writing that, we learned a long time ago, I think it was back in September, October, when we're graphing the inverse of a function, all we have to do is switch these numbers. So what I want you to do is make a table for me, same as above. And if you need to pause the video to get the setting of this table, go for it. But this time I'm going to write f and the inverse of f of x. And that little -1, if you forgot, that means your inverse. So all we have to do to graph the inverse is to switch these points. So this -3, -2, -1, and so on goes for the bottom. So I'm just going to put those numbers on the bottom. Those are my y's now. It used to be the x's, now it's the y's. My x's are going to be what my answers were up here. So I'm just going to bring those numbers down. So 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, 1, 2, 4, and 8. If I was to plot those points, you would notice that the graph would actually be on the other side of this. So it would look something like this. So that would be my inverse. So that would be y equals, I'm going to put the inverse of f of x, because we don't know the equation yet. I do want you to notice here that these two, when we have an inverse, it reflects over this line right here. And this line is y equals x. That will always happen when we have inverses. Why did I bring that up? Because this is going to help us relate to logarithms. If we were going to write the equation of the inverse, just like we would switch the points, x and y, we would do the same thing when we're writing the equation. So can you write for me the directions for number 3? What is the first step? What is the first step to find the equation? To find the equation of the inverse. So go ahead and write that down. So when we're trying to find the equation of the inverse, all we would have to do is switch the x and y. So can you write for me switch x and y? And we're going to do that. The equation was f of x equals 2 to the x, but I'm going to rewrite that as y equals 2 to the x. So y equals 2 to the x. We're going to switch the letters now. So instead of y equals, it's x equals. Instead of 2 to the x, it becomes 2 to the y. So this is our first step. The issue with this is it is very hard to get y by itself when the y is an exponent. So in order to get our equation of the inverse with y by itself, we use these things called logarithms. It's called a logarithmic function. So I'm going to have you write this little note, and then we're going to see what these look like. So here's a little note. If an inverse creates an equation with y as an exponent, you can write the inverse as a logarithm. And logarithm is spelled L-O-G-A-R-I-T-H-M. And you're going to see what that's going to look like as an equation. So anytime we have to have a y that was an exponent, and we want to write it as an inverse, we can use a logarithm. So here's what it looks like. I'm going to give you a definition of a logarithmic function. So I'm going to switch to my next page. And we're going to have our definition of a logarithmic function. So logarithmic function. So what a logarithmic function is, it is the name given to the inverse. I'm going to use all capital letters. You don't have to. It is the name given to the inverse of y equals b to the x. So if we have an equation that is an exponential function and we want the inverse of it, we can write it like this. Written as y equals log base b of x. That is a logarithmic function. This means this is the inverse of that. I'm going to put in little quotes how you would say that. When you see something like this, you would say log base b of x. So anytime we want the inverse of an equation that's an exponential function, we can write it as a log function, just like this. So I'm going to bubble something in real quick. All right, the main thing that you need to know, y equals log base b of x. Nope, I'm not going to put an equal sign. Is the same as b to the y equals x, or x equals b to the y. Let me explain. I'm going to bubble that. So when you see something that looks like this, this is the same as the inverse of this equation. So if you notice, all we do is we would take this b, the y would go as your exponent, and then you have an x. So I'm going to put this in a little bubble. This looks a little confusing, but when you see some examples, hopefully that will help. So a logarithm gives its y values, the exponent, that we must raise in order to produce the x values. So whenever we want the inverse of this equation, we can write it like this. Notice the y stays in the same place. we have our b and our x similar, but you would say log base b of x. So we're just going to do some examples practicing writing some equations. So can you write number 4, because we've left off with number 3. I want to take my function that I had here that we graphed, and I want to write the inverse of it as a log function. Okay, so I'm going to have you write these directions for me for number 4. Write the inverse. Write the inverse of y equals 2 to the x as a log function. As a log function. Now remember, we would normally on an equation like this switch the x and y. When we do that, the y becomes an exponent. So that's why we need a log function. So to write this as a log function, we are going to write y equals the log. This base becomes our base in our log. So we put base 2, and this exponent just becomes an x right next to it. This is the inverse of this. This is how you would write it. So anytime we have an equation with an exponential function, to write it as a log, you just insert the word log and you bring the 2 down as your base, and your exponent goes right next to it. This, how do you say it? Log. You would say y equals log base 2 of x. The last part of our notes is we're going to practice a couple of these and then we're done. So this is going to be part B because we just finished part A. The directions for part B: write the inverse. Write the inverse of each function. Write the inverse of each function as a logarithmic function. Logarithmic function. And the word logarithmic, we can shorten it. Sorry, logarithmic, you can shorten it to just log. So you're going to see a lot of the times I'm going to say log function instead of that big word. So we're going to do 3 examples: 1, 2, and 3. So we're just practicing writing these as a log function. So the first one is y equals 3 to the x. If we were writing the inverse of it, remember we would switch the x and y's. It would be x equals, 3 to the y. Because the y is the exponent, that's why we're making it a log function. So how we would write it would be y equals, you insert in the log, your base is 3, and you put x right next to it. So notice the 3 is lowered. How do you say this? Log base 3 of x. There's your inverse. Number 2, y equals 1/2 to the x power. If I wanted the inverse of it as a log function, I write the same thing. So y equals, I put in my log, my base is 1/2, so I lower it, and I put my x right next to the log. How do I say that? Y equals log base 1/2 of x. Last one, y equals 8 to the x. The inverse of it, remember, would make the y an exponent, so that's why we're making it a log. How would we write that? Y equals log with a base of 8 of x. So you would say log base 8 of x. That's how you would write the inverse of a function as a log function. Please make sure you submit these notes into Canvas to get credit.